I sometimes wonder if everything would have been different if my dad hadn't died that spring morning. I was only 6 years old then, yet I remember that day as if it happened only moments ago. It was a bright Sunday morning, and my dad was in the kitchen making his special pancakes. Every Sunday, he would carefully shape the batter into funny faces that never failed to make me giggle. I remember the sweet smell of butter melting on the griddle and the gentle clatter of utensils as he worked. My mom was in the adjacent room, setting the table while humming a tune that now escapes my memory. "Lily, princess, come help. Your old man just flipped these masterpieces." Dad would call out, waving his spatula like a magic wand. I would leap off the couch, often leaving behind my favorite stuffed bunny, and race to the kitchen with uncontainable excitement. That morning, however, fate intervened in the most sudden and heartbreaking way. As I reached the kitchen, the spatula clattered to the floor, and Dad clutched his chest. His face twisted in pain in a way I had never seen before. In that instant, everything changed. The world blurred into a haze of ambulance sirens, sterile hospital corridors, and my mom's anguished cries. In what felt like the blink of an eye, my father was gone. In the aftermath of that tragic morning, our once warm and lively home transformed into a place of emptiness and eerie silence. I could still recall how the house seemed too big and far too quiet without him. Although Mom's grief was palpable, it did not last for long. Soon enough, she met Richard at a community support group for widowed parents. Richard was a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a smile that, in some small way, reminded me of Dad. Within a year, Mom and Richard were married, and he moved into our home. At first, I tried to adjust to having a new father figure in my life. I remember the cautious curiosity that filled my young heart as I watched him interact with us. Then, one day, Mom dropped another bombshell. She was pregnant. I remember her face lighting up with excitement when she told me that I was going to be a big sister. I was 8 when Tommy was born, and that is when everything truly changed. From that moment on, Mom's world began to shrink until it revolved entirely around Tommy. She quit her job as an elementary school teacher, explaining that Tommy needs me whenever anyone questioned her decision. I wanted to ask about my own early years, wonder if they hadn't been crucial too, but the words always stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched silently as Mom's attention and energy became completely consumed by my little brother. I would often come home from school to find that she had forgotten to pack my lunch, only to act surprised when I mentioned that I was hungry at dinner. "Oh, I'm sorry, sweetie," she would say distractedly before immediately turning her attention back to Tommy. The pattern continued day after day. It wasn't just a few isolated instances, it became our new normal. I would sit at the dinner table, feeling invisible, while Mom fussed over Tommy's every need. One evening, as I sat alone doing my homework, I caught Richard watching Mom with a worried frown on his face. He must have noticed what I had been feeling for so long. Gently, he sat down beside me and said quietly, "You know, Lily, sometimes people get so caught up in one thing that they forget to see what else might be missing." His words, soft and full of care, gave me a moment of comfort, a small reminder that not everyone in our home had forgotten about me. As Tommy grew older, the tension in our house became impossible to ignore. Richard tried to speak with Mom countless times about her obsession with Tommy, but each attempt ended with Mom becoming defensive and angry. I recall one particular evening during dinner when Richard tried to address the issue. Tommy, who was about 5 at the time, sat quietly pushing his food around his plate as Mom hovered over him, urging him to eat just one more bite. "Sarah," Richard said, setting his fork down with a calm firmness, "we need to talk about this. You can't keep hovering over him like this. He needs to learn to do things on his own." Mom's face immediately hardened. "What are you trying to say, that I'm a bad mother?" "That's not what I meant, and you know it," she snapped. "You have 2 kids here, not one, and a husband, too. I sat there, pretending to be very interested in my mashed potatoes, while my ears absorbed every word. Deep down, I was wondering if my own needs would ever be met, but no one seemed to notice or care. In time, the situation at home reached a boiling point when Richard suggested that Tommy should be enrolled in Little League Baseball. I was sitting on the stairs, supposedly doing my homework, when I heard them arguing in the kitchen. Absolutely not. Mom's voice was shrill as she protested. Do you know how dangerous baseball can be? He could get hit by a ball or twist his ankle, or, God sake, Sarah, he needs to experience life. You can't protect him from everything. But Mom wouldn't budge. Instead of baseball, she enrolled Tommy in art classes at the community center. I still remember the sullen expression on Tommy's face as he sat there, mindlessly dragging his brush across paper while the other kids actually tried to learn. He quit after only 3 sessions, and Mom blamed the teacher for not understanding her son's creative spirit. During these trying years, Richard began to spend more time with me. Perhaps it was his way of balancing out Mom's behavior, or maybe he just saw a child who needed someone in her corner. He took me to my karate classes 3 times a week and sat through every session, cheering louder than any other parent when I earned my belts. Under Richard's gentle guidance and attention, I slowly began to flourish. Yet even as I grew, Tommy became increasingly difficult. His room turned into a complete mess, toys, clothes, and random items strewn about, forcing Mom to turn to me with that dreaded look. Lily, be a dear and clean up Tommy's room, she would say, not really asking but demanding it as a fact of life. One day, Richard finally had enough. Sarah, this arrangement isn't right. You're not his maid, he protested in a low, measured voice. He needs to learn to clean up after himself. At that moment, Mom burst into tears and pulled out what she called her ultimate weapon. You love him more than your own son, she cried, her voice cracking. How can you treat Tommy this way? I watched as Richard's face fell, and the fight left his eyes. He looked at me apologetically, then raised his hands in surrender. Fine, have it your way, he said quietly, and walked away. After that day, Richard stopped arguing with Mom about Tommy, but the look he gave me said everything. He had not given up on me, even if he had surrendered the battle with Mom. It was a small comfort, but sometimes, small comforts are all we have. High school graduation day arrived, bittersweet and full of mixed emotions. As I stood in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for a familiar face, I spotted Richard beaming proudly in the audience. Mom was there too, though she was busy checking her phone, no doubt texting Tommy's babysitter or worrying about some other trivial matter. Later that evening, Richard called me into his study. He pulled out a folder full of college brochures and said, I've been saving up. You can go wherever you want, Lily. Sky's the limit. Before I could even respond, Mom burst in. You can't be serious, she exclaimed. That money should be saved for Tommy's future, he's going to need it more. Richard's face hardened into an expression I had grown all too familiar with during these confrontations. This is non-negotiable, Sarah. I've already made my decision. In the end, I chose to attend Marshall University in West Virginia, a place far enough to start fresh, but not so far that I couldn't visit home occasionally. The day Richard helped me move into my dorm was bittersweet. Mom couldn't come because Tommy had developed severe anxiety about her leaving. For the first time in my life, college offered me a taste of freedom, a chance to escape the constant shadow of being the less favored child. I called home every week, but my conversations were mostly with Richard, not Mom. Mom's attention was always elsewhere, consumed by her relentless focus on Tommy. During one of our calls, Richard's tired voice explained, he's hanging out with these kids from the wrong side of the tracks. I tried to get him involved in some after-school programs, but your mother, well, she says I'm being too hard on him. I had to interrupt, unsure of what more I could say. Exactly, Richard sighed. She calls me a tyrant for suggesting he might need some structure. My visits home became less frequent as Tommy's behavior worsened. When I did return, Tommy barely acknowledged my presence. He would lock himself in his room, absorbed in his video games, his eyes fixed on the flickering screens, and his demeanor growing more distant and angry. In contrast, I was busy building my future. After graduation, I landed a job at DOE in their consulting division. I stayed in West Virginia, building my career while watching from afar as my brother descended further into self-imposed isolation. On one of my rare visits home, I mustered the courage to knock on Tommy's door. "Tommy, want to grab lunch?" "My treat," I offered hopefully. All I received in response was the sound of gunfire from the video game he was playing. Mom, passing by in the hallway, merely shrugged. "He's not feeling social today, he's very stressed," she explained. The contrast between our lives couldn't have been starker. While I was pursuing my career goals, Tommy was content with virtual achievements, supported by Mom's endless excuses and misguided priorities. Richard's disappointed face said it all. By then, even he had largely given up on trying to intervene. By the age of 27, I had finally saved enough for a down payment on my own place. It wasn't huge, just a one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood, but it was mine. The day I received the keys, I couldn't stop smiling. All those years of saving, of brown bag lunches, and of saying no to designer clothes had finally paid off. During my weekly call home, I excitedly announced, "You all have to come see it, I'm having a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll even cook dinner, Richard, I'm making your favorite lasagna." "Wouldn't miss it for the world, kiddo," Richard replied warmly. But then Mom's voice cut in on the other line. "Oh honey, I don't think we can make it. Tommy has plans that day." I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. "Plans? What kind of plans?" I asked. "Very important ones," Mom said vaguely. In the background, I could hear the constant blare of Tommy's video game. The day of the housewarming arrived, and only Richard showed up. He brought along a potted plant and a bottle of wine, saying, "Your mother sends her love." But we both knew that wasn't true. Over dinner, Richard filled me in on what was really happening at home. Tommy, now 20 years old, hadn't bothered with college and spent his days either gaming or hanging out with his drinking buddies. Richard had tried to help by offering him a position at his construction company, as a starting point. "Everyone needs to start somewhere," Richard explained while twirling pasta on his fork. "Not so fast," Mom countered, shaking her head. "It would be beneath him." Can you believe that? Tommy is too intelligent for manual labor, too intelligent to work even, but not too intelligent to mooch off his parents. I could only mutter softly, "I keep trying, Lily." God knows I keep trying, as Richard gave me a sad smile. That was the last real conversation we had about Tommy. 2 years later, I received a call that changed everything. Richard had collapsed at work, a massive heart attack, just like my father's. By the time I reached the hospital, it was too late, Richard was gone. His funeral was surreal, a mix of somber reality and melodramatic performances. Mom put on quite a show, sobbing dramatically and telling everyone what a wonderful husband Richard had been. "We were so happy," she wailed, "how will we manage without him?" I watched her performance with a mixture of disgust and pity. It was clear that her tears were less about genuine grief for Richard and more about the loss of security his income had provided. Without Richard's steady earnings, how would she maintain the lifestyle Tommy had grown accustomed to? At the funeral, Tommy didn't even bother to wear a proper suit. He showed up in wrinkled khakis and a faded polo shirt that had clearly seen better days. For most of the service, he stared at his phone, barely acknowledging anyone around him. Meanwhile, Mom made excuses for his behavior, insisting that he was processing his grief in his own way. Standing at Richard's grave, I couldn't help but notice the painful irony. Yet another father figure lost, another heart attack, another funeral, and now I was old enough to see everything clearly. I realized that Mom's tears were more about her own financial fears than about any true sorrow for Richard. A year after Richard's death, I had mostly lost touch with both Mom and Tommy. The few updates I received came through occasional calls from Aunt Linda. "They're getting by on Richard's savings," she would say. I learned that Mom had sold Richard's old Chevrolet just last month, and before that, the tools from his workshop had been auctioned off. I tried not to care too much, even though it hurt. I really did care, but the distance between us grew wider with every passing day. Then, one Tuesday evening, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Mom's number, and my heart skipped a beat. Her voice, now softer and smaller than I remembered, pleaded, "Lily, I need you to come home. Please." There was an urgency in her tone that I couldn't ignore. Without a second thought, I booked a flight for the very next day. When I arrived at our old house, I barely recognized it. The once pristine home that Richard had lovingly maintained was now overgrown with weeds. The paint on the window frames was peeling, and one of the shutters hung crookedly. Inside, the atmosphere was just as dismal. Mom herself had changed dramatically. The vibrant, youthful woman I once knew now looked at least 20 years older than her actual age. Deep wrinkles lined her face, and her hair, once perfectly styled and colored, was now streaked with stark gray roots. She greeted me at the door and led me into the living room. The air was heavy with the smell of must and neglect. Dishes were piled high in the sink, and a thin layer of dust coated every surface. The home that I had once known as a safe haven now felt like a time capsule of lost memories and broken dreams. "Come, sit down," Mom said, her voice trembling as she guided me to the couch. I sank into the worn cushions, trying to steady my racing thoughts. After a few moments of silence, she confessed, "We're running out of money, Lily. My pension barely covers the utilities, and our savings, they're almost gone." She twisted her hands in her lap as if to hold on to something that might save us. "What about Tommy? Is he helping with expenses?" I asked softly. Her face contorted in a complicated dance between embarrassment and defensiveness. "He's looking for work," she insisted. "It's not his fault. These employers just don't understand him. The last place wanted him to start at 8 o'clock in the morning, Tommy's not a morning person, and the one before that expected him to do manual labor with his intelligence." I could feel my jaw tightening as I tried to hold back the flood of memories and resentments. At his age and with no experience, he can't exactly be picky about a job, I murmured. "You don't understand," Mom cut me off, her voice rising to that all-too-familiar pitch that always preceded what I now knew as a Tommy defense. Then, almost abruptly, her tone softened. "Lily, we need your help. We won't survive without it. I hate to ask, but you're doing so well in your career. How much can you send?" I knew what was coming. Part of me wanted to refuse, to finally remind her of all the times she had chosen Tommy over me, but looking into her worn, desperate eyes, I found myself unable to. "$1, $500 per month," she whispered. I nearly choked on the words. It was a significant chunk of my salary, yet in that moment, I simply nodded in resignation. "Where's Tommy now?" I asked, my voice barely audible as I prepared to leave. "He's at a job interview," Mom said, her face lighting up with a brief moment of hope. "It's for a very promising position with a tech company." Through the window, I could see a faint light coming from Tommy's bedroom, the familiar flicker of his computer screen as he sat there, lost in his own world. Some things, it seemed, never changed. True to my word, I set up an automatic transfer of $1,500 to Mom's account every month. Each time I saw that deduction from my bank balance, I tried to tell myself that it was the right thing to do, even if it meant postponing my own plans for a bigger apartment or a new car. I started visiting home more frequently, even though every visit felt like stepping into a time capsule. Tommy was always there, either glued to his computer screen or sprawled on the couch with a beer in hand. "How's the job search going?" I would ask, only to be met with a curt, "mind your own business," or sometimes just a gruff grunt before he turned up the volume on his game. During the holidays, I couldn't bear to see the state of the living room. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, a water stain marred the ceiling, and the overall neglect reminded me of Richard's numerous efforts to fix things. One Christmas, I used my bonus money to hire contractors to repair the damages. It wasn't much, but it was a way for me to reclaim a small piece of our former home. When Mom sprained her ankle in February, I immediately called to check on her. "Oh, it's not so bad," she said, though I could hear the pain in her voice. I asked, "Is Tommy helping you?" She replied, "He's busy with some online interviews." The very next day, I hired a home health aide with the money I had been saving for a vacation. Then, one day, I walked into the house and found a stranger sprawled across our sofa. She looked as if she had stepped straight out of a reality TV show. Her fake nails, heavy makeup, and provocative clothes left little to the imagination. She was scrolling through her phone, surrounded by empty chip bags and soda cans. "Who are you?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. Tommy emerged from his room almost nonchalantly and announced, "This is Candy, my fiancée. She lives here now." Candy didn't even look up from her phone. She popped her gum loudly and continued scrolling as if my question were unimportant. I watched in disbelief as she reached into a grocery bag I had just set down and helped herself to the premium cookies I had bought for Mom. "Nice to meet you, too," I mumbled under my breath, feeling an overwhelming mix of anger and sorrow at the state of our family. Later that evening, I called Mom to get her take on the situation. "Oh, Lily," she said, sounding more animated than I had heard in months. "Isn't it wonderful? Tommy's finally settling down. Candy has been such a good influence on him, he hasn't gone out drinking with those awful friends in weeks." Her voice was full of misplaced pride. "That's because she's been drinking all my imported beer at home," I thought, recalling the empty bottles I had seen in the recycling bin. But I said nothing, knowing that any confrontation would only bring more heartache. Mom went on, explaining how Candy's cousin knew someone at a tech startup and that Tommy claimed it could be his big break. I made noncommittal noises, my mind drifting to the dozens of big breaks Tommy had mentioned over the years, none of which had come to fruition. Yet Mom was so happily lost in her bubble of perpetual hope that I couldn't bring myself to burst it. My next visit home began like any other. I juggled grocery bags as I pushed open the front door, only to stop dead in my tracks. The house looked as if a tornado had swept through it, dirty dishes piled high in the sink, takeout containers scattered across every surface, and clothes strewn about the living room floor. Candy lay sprawled on the couch, her perfectly manicured nails tapping away on her phone. As I set down the groceries, I couldn't hold back. "You know," I said sharply, "this is my house too. You live here, eating food that I pay for. The least you could do is wash a dish or two." Candy slowly looked up, a smirk playing across her heavily glossed lips. "Who do you think you are to come in here and give orders? This isn't your house," she retorted coolly. "I grew up here," I shot back, my voice trembling with years of pent-up resentment. "You're just a guest." Then, in a moment that froze my blood, Candy laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh honey, you've got it all wrong. This house belongs to Tommy now. Your mom signed everything over to him, a will and everything. I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath me. Is it true? I asked, my voice sounding strangely hollow as I stared at Mom, who was in the kitchen organizing unused coupons. Mom met my gaze reluctantly. Yes, she said flatly, fiddling with the papers in front of her. It's true. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and I could see a hardness in her eyes that I had never seen before. I don't understand, I began, but the words died on my lips. I'm the one helping you, she continued, her tone rising sharply. I'm the one sending money every month. Tommy doesn't work, he doesn't contribute anything. Don't you dare talk about your brother that way. Her voice, now rising into what I recognized as the familiar Tommy defense, grew even more intense. You don't understand him. You never have, she insisted. Then, as if she had reached the end of her emotional reserves, she suddenly changed her tone. Lily, we need your help. We won't survive without it. Her eyes, filled with desperation and a hint of defeat, searched mine for understanding. I took a deep breath and, with a shaking heart, asked, How much do you need? $500 per month, she whispered, and I nearly choked on the words. That sum, a significant portion of my salary, was a demand I had heard time and again. I found myself nodding in resignation, even as a small voice inside me cried out for fairness. Where's Tommy now? I managed to ask as I prepared to leave. Tommy's at a job interview, Mom said, her face brightening for a moment with hope. It's for a promising position with a tech company. Through the window, I could see the soft glow of Tommy's bedroom light and the familiar flicker of his computer screen, a sign that some parts of him had not changed, that he was still lost in his own digital world. For months after that conversation, I continued to set up my automatic transfer of $1,500 each month. Every time I saw that deduction from my bank balance, I reminded myself that I was doing the right thing, even if it meant putting my own dreams on hold. I dreamed of a bigger apartment, a nicer car, maybe even saving for a real house someday. But those dreams always took a back seat to the needs of our fractured family. As the years went by, I found myself visiting home more frequently, even though each visit felt like stepping back into a painful memory. Tommy's life continued down a troubled path. He spent most of his days either glued to his computer or lounging on the couch with a beer in hand. When I tried to engage him, he would often snap, "Mind your own business," or simply turn up the volume on his game, drowning out any conversation. I remember one particularly cold winter day when I knocked on Tommy's door, offering to take him out for lunch. "Tommy, let's grab a bite, I'll treat you," I said with as much cheer as I could muster. But instead of answering, all I heard was the echo of gunfire from his video game. Mom, passing by in the hall, simply shrugged and said, "He's not feeling social today, he's very stressed." The stark contrast between our lives was painful. While I was steadily building a career and nurturing my own dreams, Tommy was trapped in a cycle of virtual achievements and self-destruction. By the time I turned 27, I had managed to save enough for a down payment on my very own apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood, but it was entirely mine. On the day I received the keys, I couldn't help but smile. Every sacrifice I had made, the skipped lunches, the long hours at work, the constant putting of my dreams on hold, had finally paid off. I called home that day to share the news. "You all have to come see it," I announced over the phone. "I'm having a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll cook dinner too, Richard, I'm even making your favorite lasagna." "Wouldn't miss it for the world, kiddo," Richard replied warmly, though his tone carried a note of sorrow that I had come to recognize. But before I could get too excited, Mom interjected. "Oh, honey, I don't think we can make it. Tommy has plans that day." I couldn't help but feel a sting of disappointment as I asked, "Plans? What kind of plans?" Mom only replied, "Very important ones," her voice vague and uncertain. In the background, the unmistakable sound of Tommy's video game echoed faintly, a reminder that he was still caught in his own world. The day of the housewarming came, and only Richard showed up. He brought a small potted plant and a bottle of wine, saying with a hint of forced cheer, "Your mother sends her love." But we both knew that his words were nothing more than a polite facade. Over dinner, Richard filled me in on what was really happening at home. Tommy, now 20 years old, had never bothered with college. Instead, he spent his days either gaming or hanging out with his drinking buddies. Richard had once tried to help him by offering a job at his construction company, insisting that everyone had to start somewhere. "Tommy needs to learn responsibility," Richard had said softly as he twirled pasta on his fork. "But your mother," Mom would immediately counter, shaking her head. "It would be beneath him," she'd argue. "Can you believe that? Tommy is too intelligent for manual labor, too intelligent to work, yet he's perfectly content to live off our money." I could only listen silently as the conversation unfolded, feeling both anger and sorrow mix within me. 2 years after that fateful conversation, I received a phone call that shattered the remaining remnants of my hope. Richard had collapsed at work from a massive heart attack, just like Dad had, so many years ago. I rushed to the hospital, only to find that he had already passed away. The funeral was surreal. Mom put on an extravagant display of grief, sobbing dramatically and telling anyone who would listen what a wonderful husband Richard had been. "We were so happy," she wailed, "how will we manage without him?" I watched her performance with a heavy mix of disgust and pity. It became painfully clear that her tears were not entirely for Richard, they were also a lament for the security his income had provided. Without his financial support, the future looked bleak, especially for Tommy, whose lavish lifestyle was built on that very foundation. At the funeral, Tommy appeared in wrinkled khakis and a faded polo shirt, his disinterest palpable as he stared at his phone throughout the service. While Mom made elaborate excuses for his behavior, claiming that he was simply processing his grief in his own way, I could see the truth behind it. Standing by Richard's grave, I couldn't help but think about how history had repeated itself. Another father figure was gone, another heart attack had taken someone dear, and another funeral had forced me to confront the harsh realities of our family. I realized that I was old enough now to see clearly. Mom's tears were driven more by her financial desperation than by true sorrow. A year passed, and with it, I lost almost all contact with Mom and Tommy. The only news I received came from sporadic calls from Aunt Linda. "They're surviving on Richard's savings," she would say, her tone a mixture of sympathy and resignation. I learned that Mom had even sold Richard's old Chevrolet just last month, and that the tools from his workshop had been auctioned off long ago. I tried my best not to care, though deep down, I felt a sting of betrayal with every piece of news. Then, one Tuesday evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mom's number, and without hesitation, I answered. Her voice was small and trembling as she pleaded, "Lily, I need you to come home. Please." Something in her tone, raw and desperate, made it impossible for me to refuse. I booked a flight for the very next day, my heart heavy with apprehension and unresolved emotions. When I arrived at our old house, I was struck by how little it resembled the home of my childhood. The once pristine exterior, lovingly maintained by Richard, was now overgrown with weeds. The paint on the window frames had peeled away, and one of the shutters hung crookedly. Stepping inside, I was hit by the musty smell of neglect and decay. Dishes were piled high in the sink, and a thin layer of dust coated every surface. The house was a haunting reminder of the past, a time when things were different, when laughter filled every room. Mom met me at the door, but she was not the woman I once knew. The vibrant, loving mother of my childhood had been replaced by someone who looked decades older than her actual age. Deep wrinkles etched her face, and her hair, once perfectly styled, was now streaked with gray. Come in, Lily, she said softly, leading me to the living room. I sank into an old armchair, trying to steady the whirlwind of memories and emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. After a long silence, Mom began to speak. "We're running out of money, Lily," she confessed, her voice trembling as she twisted her hands together. "My pension barely covers the utilities, and our savings, they're almost gone." I listened in silence as she detailed the financial troubles that had befallen us. When I asked about Tommy, she explained that he was supposedly looking for work, though the details were vague and unsatisfying. "He's out there," she said, "but employers just don't understand him." Her words ignited a familiar mix of anger and sadness within me. I remembered the countless times I had listened to her defend Tommy's lack of ambition, always insisting that he was too special or too misunderstood to be expected to contribute. Now, with Richard gone and our resources dwindling, I realized how much I had been sacrificed over the years. In a moment of painful clarity, I knew that I had to make a change. Reluctantly, I agreed to set up an automatic transfer of $1,500 per month to help cover the bills. Every time I saw that deduction from my bank account, I felt a pang of regret for the sacrifices I had made for a family that had long forgotten how to care for one another. Still, I convinced myself that it was the right thing to do. After all, I had been the one who had helped keep the family afloat for so many years. In the following months, my visits home became more frequent, and each time I returned, I was confronted with the same scene of decay and neglect. Tommy was always there, either lost in his computer games or lounging on the worn-out sofa with a beer in hand. "How's the job search going?" I would ask tentatively, only to be met with a curt, "mind your own business," or a dismissive grunt as he turned up the volume on his game. During the holidays, the state of the house was even more unbearable. The wallpaper had peeled away in long strips, and a persistent water stain on the ceiling reminded me of all the repairs that had never been made. Determined to reclaim a little dignity for the home I once knew, I used my Christmas bonus to hire contractors to fix what I could. It wasn't much, but it was a small act of love for a place that held so many memories. Then, one fateful day, as I walked into the house with grocery bags in hand, I found a stranger sprawled across the sofa. She looked as if she had stepped out of a reality TV show. Her fake nails, heavy makeup, and provocative clothes made it clear that she was not part of my family's history. Surrounded by empty chip bags and soda cans, she scrolled through her phone with an air of casual entitlement. "Who are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Tommy emerged from his room and announced without any hint of apology, "This is Candy, my fiancée. She lives here now." Candy didn't bother to look up from her phone as she continued scrolling, and when I muttered a half-hearted "nice to meet you, too," she simply popped her gum loudly in response. Later that evening, I called Mom to get her take on the situation. Her voice, unexpectedly bright and animated, filled the line with praise for Candy. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said. "Tommy's finally settling down. Candy has been such a good influence on him. He hasn't been out drinking with those awful friends in weeks." I listened, numb, as Mom explained that Candy's cousin knew someone at a tech startup and that Tommy was now on the verge of a big break. I couldn't help but think of the many big breaks Tommy had mentioned over the years, each one promising a brighter future, yet none coming to fruition. But Mom was so happily ensconced in her hopeful bubble that I dared not burst it. One day, my next visit home began as usual. I carried heavy grocery bags through the front door, only to stop dead in my tracks at the sight before me. The house was in complete disarray. Dirty dishes were piled high in the sink, takeout containers and scattered clothes littered every surface. Candy, perched on the couch with her phone in hand, barely looked up as I set down the groceries. "You know," I said sharply, "this is my house too. You live here, and you eat food that I pay for. The least you could do is wash a dish or two." Candy slowly lifted her gaze, a smirk playing across her glossy lips. Who do you think you are to come in here giving orders? This isn't your house, she replied coolly. I felt a surge of anger, but also a deep sadness. I grew up here, I countered, my voice trembling with the weight of years spent feeling forgotten. You're just a guest now. At that moment, Candy burst into a harsh, triumphant laugh, a laugh that made my skin crawl. Oh honey, she said, you've got it all wrong. This house belongs to Tommy now. Your mom signed everything over to him, a will, and everything. I stared at Mom, who was busy organizing old coupons in the kitchen, and my heart sank. Is it true? I asked quietly, my voice barely a whisper. Mom's eyes met mine, and after a long pause, she admitted, yes, it's true. I signed it over to him. The words fell flat, and I could barely process what I was hearing. I don't understand, I murmured, feeling as if everything I once believed had been shattered in that moment. Her next words were like a blow. I'm the one who has been helping you, she insisted. I'm the one sending money every month because Tommy doesn't work. He doesn't contribute anything. Don't you dare talk about your brother that way. Her voice rose, filled with a familiar intensity that always preceded a defense of Tommy. You just don't understand him. You never have. I felt the weight of every moment, the years of neglect, the countless sacrifices I had made, and finally, with a voice steadier than I expected, I said, Mom, I'm done. I can't keep sacrificing for a family that only seems to value one child over the other. In that moment, every painful memory, every small injustice, came flooding back. I turned and walked out, feeling for the first time in years that I was reclaiming my own life. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the long 4-hour trip, or even climbing the stairs to my small apartment. What I do remember was the moment of clarity that came as I stared at my phone, the screen showing yet another deduction, the $1,500 I had been sending every month. My finger hovered over the cancellation button before I decisively clicked to stop the recurring payment for the next few cycles. In that instant, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. I threw myself into my work, channeling all my energy into building a future that was mine alone. I began researching investment options for the money that had once flowed out of my bank account every month. Perhaps, I thought, it was time to start saving for a house of my own, a real house, not just a small apartment. A place where I could finally feel at peace, free from the guilt, the angry messages, and the never-ending demands. Exactly 1 month after my last visit home, I received a call from Mom. The money didn't come through, she said, without any preamble or pleasantries. There must be some mistake with the bank. I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, there's no mistake, I canceled the transfers. After a long moment of stunned silence, she exploded, You. How dare you stop sending money after everything I've done for you? I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at her words. Everything you've done for me? I echoed, recalling all those years of neglect, of being cast aside in favor of Tommy. You forced me to be Tommy's maid, and now you say you never loved me? Her voice shifted immediately, sliding into that familiar defense of Tommy. That's different. You know I was upset, but you can't just stop helping us, we're counting on that money. The conversation descended into a blur of accusations and demands. I listened quietly for a moment before saying, Goodbye, Mom. I hung up and blocked her number, determined not to let her guilt trips or angry messages control my life any longer. In the following weeks, messages began pouring in through every possible channel, Facebook messages, Instagram comments, emails detailing sacrifices I couldn't even remember happening. Tommy joined in, sending aggressive texts about how I was destroying the family and how Mom was crying because of me. One message read, You better start sending money again, or else I'll block you too. I took a deep breath and replied once, "Here's a crazy idea, try getting a job, Candy." I even saw a lengthy message on LinkedIn from Mom, accusing me of breaking her poor heart and making Tommy too sensitive for work. At that point, I couldn't help but admire her creative way of twisting things, but I also realized something crucial. For the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty about finally standing up for myself. The $1,500 I once sent every month was now safely tucked away as a down payment fund for my own house. I could finally sleep better at night, unburdened by angry messages and guilt-tripping calls. I knew that Richard, who had always cared for me, would be proud of me for finally reclaiming my life. One day, as I drove past a construction site displaying a now hiring sign, I felt a brief urge to send a picture to Tommy. But then I smiled to myself and kept driving. Their problems were no longer my problems. After years of hope, of making excuses, and of trying desperately to earn my mother's love, I finally felt free. I stood at the threshold of my own future, a future built on my own terms, free from the chains of a past that had long ago lost its warmth and care. The scars of those painful years would always remain, but they no longer held power over me. I had found the strength to walk away, to reclaim my identity and my dreams. In the quiet moments that followed, I often reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought me here. I remembered the sound of Dad's laughter as he flipped pancakes shaped like smiling faces, and the way his eyes would light up when he saw me run into the kitchen. I recalled the bittersweet moments of childhood, of a mother whose love had once been a comfort, yet had gradually become a source of neglect. And I remembered Richard's gentle guidance, which had offered me solace during the darkest times. Each memory, painful and tender in equal measure, served as a reminder of the family I had once known and the person I had become. I knew that I could not change the past, but I could choose my future. I began to fill my new home with small reminders of hope, a few photographs of happier times, a well-worn book of poetry, and even a small plant that I cared for with quiet determination. Every small act of creation and care was a step away from the past and toward a future that was entirely my own. As the days turned into months, I found solace in the steady rhythm of my new life. I dedicated myself to my work, growing in confidence and competence. I met new people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give to a struggling family. I even started to explore hobbies I had long abandoned, walking through nearby parks, writing in a journal, and occasionally revisiting the memories of my childhood with a sense of bittersweet nostalgia. Yet, even as I built this new life, the old wounds never fully healed. There were evenings when I would sit alone in my modest apartment, staring at the bank statement that showed the now-stopped transfers, and wonder if I had made the right choice. But then I would remember the angry messages, the hollow promises, and the relentless cycle of sacrifice that had defined my past. I realized that true freedom sometimes comes at the cost of difficult decisions, and that by standing up for myself, I had begun to heal. In time, the memories of those long, painful years became less vivid. They were replaced by a quiet resilience, a deep understanding that family bonds can be as fragile as they are binding. I learned to cherish the love I had for myself, the hope that had driven me to break free from a cycle of dependence and neglect. And while I never forgot the sacrifices I had made, I also never regretted the choice to create a life that was mine alone. Now, when I pass by a construction site or see a now hiring sign, I do not feel the urge to reach out to those who once tried to control my life. Instead, I smile at the irony of it all, knowing that I have finally learned to prioritize my own well-being. I have discovered that true independence means not being held hostage by the expectations and demands of others. And as I continue to build my future, brick by brick, day by day, I find solace in the simple truth that I am finally free. In the quiet moments before sleep, I sometimes close my eyes and picture the faces of those I once loved, the smiling face of my dad, the hopeful eyes of Richard, and even the troubled, distant gaze of Tommy. Each face carries its own story, its own heartbreak. But now, as I move forward, I embrace the reality that I have the power to shape my own destiny. The echoes of the past no longer define me, they serve only as a reminder of how far I have come and the strength it took to leave behind a world that had become unbearable. I know there will be challenges ahead, new obstacles, moments of doubt, and times when the old wounds might resurface. But I also know that I have learned to stand on my own, to cherish the quiet moments of victory and the small joys that come from living life on my own terms. And in that knowledge, I find peace. After all, family is not only defined by the bonds of blood, but also by the strength of our choices, the courage to break free, and the determination to create a future that truly belongs to us. I have chosen my path, and with every step I take, I am reminded that the true measure of a person is not in the sacrifices they have made, but in the hope they hold for a better tomorrow. Today, I wake each morning with a renewed sense of purpose. I greet the day with determination and a quiet confidence that comes from knowing that I am responsible for my own happiness. I no longer carry the burden of guilt, nor do I listen to the echoes of demands that once dictated my every move. Instead, I build a future where every decision, every act of self-care is a testament to the person I have become, a person who is finally free. And so, as I sit here writing these words, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that has brought me to this point. I have endured loss, heartbreak, and betrayal, but I have also found strength, resilience, and a newfound love for life. The scars remain, but they no longer define me. They are simply reminders of a time when I had to fight for every scrap of dignity and every ounce of hope. In that ongoing struggle, I discovered who I truly am, a person capable of overcoming even the darkest of times, a person who has learned that freedom is not given, but earned through perseverance and self-respect. Every sacrifice, every tear shed in silence, has led me to this moment of clarity and peace. I no longer look back with regret, instead, I see a path that has forged the person I am today. Now, as I prepare for another day in my modest home, I feel a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I have finally taken control of my own life. I have learned that the most important relationship I can nurture is the one I have with myself. And in that self-love, I find the strength to build a future filled with promise, hope, and endless possibilities. I sometimes reflect on that long-ago spring morning, the day my life changed forever, and I realize that while I lost my father then, I also gained a clarity that has carried me through every trial since. The memory of his warm smile and gentle laughter remains with me, a beacon of light in even the darkest moments. And though I mourn him still, I now understand that his love lives on in every decision I make to stand up for myself. This journey has not been easy, and the road ahead may still be fraught with challenges. But I am no longer a child waiting for approval or a parent's affection. I am an adult who has learned to cherish my own worth, to build a life that reflects my values and dreams. And as I continue on this path, I know that every step I take is a victory over the past, a declaration that I am finally free. In the end, the choices we make define us. I chose to break free from the cycle of sacrifice and neglect. I chose to invest in myself rather than in a family dynamic that had long since lost its balance. And with each new day, I remind myself that my worth is not measured by the money I send home or the demands I endure, but by the strength I show in reclaiming my own future. I have come to understand that while family can be a source of both pain and joy, the true foundation of a happy life is the ability to love oneself. Today, I walk forward with my head held high, free from the chains of the past and ready to embrace whatever comes next. This is my story, a story of loss, struggle, resilience, and ultimately, freedom. And as I write these words, I know that I have finally found the courage to live for myself. Every morning, I wake up with a renewed commitment to my dreams, a commitment that no one else can take away. I fill my days with the work that brings me fulfillment, the friendships that uplift me, and the quiet moments of reflection that remind me of my strength. I have learned that even in the midst of chaos, there is beauty to be found in the simple act of choosing to be free. I know that the wounds of the past will always leave their marks, but they no longer hold power over me. I have transformed pain into purpose, and in doing so, I have discovered the true meaning of independence. With every step I take, I honor the memory of those I have lost, while forging a future that is entirely my own. And so, I continue on this journey, one day at a time, confident in the knowledge that I have finally found my way out of the shadows. I have learned that true freedom lies not in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to face it head-on and choose a different path. Today, I am that person, a person who has learned to stand on her own, to love herself fiercely, and to build a life that is rich with hope and possibility. I am free.